I'd like to thank you all for coming to this first PCA talk of the semester. And I'm very honored to have Nicolas Nova coming to visit the school. Nicolas Nova is an incredible researcher who studied at EPFL in cognitive science and computer interaction. You've seen his writings. He's a prolific writer. You've seen his writing. You've seen his presentation. He's gone all over the world to talk about his field. He's been to the MIT Medialab, SXSW, Next, all the places that one day you'll probably be going to. He's the co-founder of the Near Future Lab, which is quite incredible. He's also a professor at HEDS, which is the Geneva School of Art and Design. And I guess there are so many titles associated and with what you're doing. I think I'm not going to talk about them all, but I'm very happy to welcome you to hear your point of view on design ethnography, which is the reason why you're here. Designers have been using social science method or transforming them in order to legitimize their work, and I'd like to hear your point of view on it. I thank you very much for welcoming Nicolas Nova. Merci.
So good evening, everyone. The setup here is a bit different than what I have regularly, so I may turn my back to watch the next slides. Not that I don't like you, it's just that I need to watch what's going on there. So I want to talk about design ethnography, or design and ethnography, which is one of my research topic. Just to clear things out, what I mean by that is very well represented in that quote from this kind of like seminal paper, as we say, very important paper in the field that try to set a definition of what is meant by design ethnography. As Yasmin just said, it's the idea that designers in their activities appropriated ethnography, like a methodology used by sociologists or anthropologists, and used that in their activities for like new product development, service design, etc. And that quote is interesting, although there's been some use of or relationship between ethnography and design for a long time, and this is 1999, but it happened before. So I'm personally interested in this for different reasons, for different questions, different issues. My background is a mix between social sciences and human-computer interaction design. And the reason why I'm interested in this like relationship between design and ethnography is because I find it important to question what happened when designers try to appropriate this kind of method and use that in their work. So what does it mean when designers do ethnography or field research, which means going on the field, asking questions, observing, participating in an activity and then use that as material for design research or product or service design. And eventually the main question that I find interesting is whether there is a designerly way of conducting ethnography. This is like a weird adverb that comes from the long tradition in design research, looking at how designers have their own way to do things. Is there a proper way or a designer's way to do ethnography? That's the question I'm interested in. And in order to answer this question, it's been a long time, and I'm interested in that. I applied the ethnographic method to designers applying ethnography, which means that I spend time in design studios, designers' places, in different design environments to understand how the designers, to observe how they conduct interview, they run their own observation on the field, and try to understand what happened when they appropriate this approach. It led to this book, which is sadly out of print, and there's going to be a second edition, but the PDF is online. That's a research project I've done with the Geneva School of Art and Design. Public money, which means that we put the material online if you're interested in, and it's free. And at the time I did that, I wrote that with my colleagues, who was 2 years ago. We were really interested in how designers appropriated ethnography in the context of their work. And as time passed, I became more and more interested in how designers, in their way to conduct ethnography, how this might be also interesting for social sciences, and whether this designerly way of conducting ethnography would be also interesting for social sciences and not only design. So my purpose tonight is to show you some case studies, like 4 case studies of how designers use ethnography in their work. Show you the materiality of this, and that's one of the main points, because design is about shaping and transforming information, things, material, and that's a bit different from how sociologists or anthropologists might do ethnography, because they rather use words or pictures to do that. Designers might do other things, and I'll get back to that through those case studies, and then show what it means in terms of ethnography/design relationship, and try to conclude about the implications. What does it mean for social sciences and design? So first case, in general, when in the corporate world, when designers use field research and ethnography to conduct interviews and understand what it's like to be a user of a product or a service, the interviews, the observations, they're transformed into a set of very normalized type of design artifacts, like personas, for instance. I guess you're all familiar with what it is, and if not, probably Yasmin's going to give you a bad grade. So personas is one of those way to transform material that is observed or taken from the field and turn that into profiles. Could be fictional profiles or not fictional, that reflect who the users are, and that eventually can be used for designing something, depending on these kind of target groups. Experience maps, the sequence of different operations that people conduct in a set of activity, in a course of action, rendered graphically. That's also a common type of artifact used by designers. That's a bit different from how an anthropologist might do, but it's quite close. The idea that you observe something and then you describe this sequence of operation, and in general, the design purpose here is to try to make that simpler, with less steps, or there's some value in the steps that happen between point 0 and the end point. Here, that's quite interesting because anthropologists have similar tools, but it's often less visual than this example. Models, research models. I think I found that one online about the user experience of music. The idea would be that after observing people or interviewing people about certain topics, like how people use music or how people enjoy music in their life, there's some sort of abstract representation of what it is to, deal with music, with which kind of tools, which kind of explorations, which kind of tools to explore your music, etc., etc. So that's, if I had to draw a line between observation, which are very basic, and something more abstract, this would be at the end. It's quite abstract, but it helps to think about what a product could be. Like, if we know that the important parameters, the important factor for the user experience of music are located on that kind of model, maybe we can, play with those and try to think about certain features that can, serve those functions. And of course, prototyping with different means is often performed or conducted based on the field research, the design decisions that one can take with like paper prototyping. I like that one. It's from Nintendo. It's when they designed the Wii U controller. I think it's those videos by Nintendo where one of the CEO explains how they did it. That's why it's not exactly a designer's sleeve, but it's interesting because they show the type of prototype and they explain how they created those very basic cardboard type of prototypes and how these prototypes were based on their observation of users, of players, and their observations of players using this quite basic type of prototype with cardboard that can slide, and that's a way to test their ideas. That's me testing a prototype of some sort of augmented reality system. So in the end, I mean, all those examples, the personas, the experience maps, the prototypes, the models, they're based on the field observations. The field observation and interviews are transformed into those objects, and those objects are closer and closer to the prototype or product or a service. And that's the main use of ethnography, especially in corporate context, to try to turn the observations into a product or a service. Another example, this one comes from one of a student from the Royal College of Art from a few years ago, and I quite like it because it shows also what happened in an academic context, in a design, in an applied art school, how field research and observation can be used. So here, that's the sort of master's thesis of the student, I think. I don't think I can pronounce his name, sorry about that. The student was interested in going into a place he didn't know anything about. I think it's in Cape Town in South Africa. And he was interested in observing things there, observing DIY, do-it-yourself practices, fab labs, and some sort of like bricolage type of practice. And he went there and he created this document afterwards that describes the research he conducted, the location and the things he observed there, using pictures that shows the ambience, the atmosphere of the communities he was interested in. He wrote some personal observations which are very detailed about some really specific things. There almost no generalization here. Unlike the previous examples where in corporate context it's often the case that designers have a set of personas or experience map that try to map the general experience and generalize from a set of people. Here it's just about finding some sort of ideas or weird ideas to design something else. There's short descriptions of what he observed, and then there's this thing that he designed, which is basically a sort of prototype of a device that can be used to create sounds and modify sounds, a sort of sound system device. The object itself is less important in what I'm trying to say here than the fact that this object was designed based on the observation he made, the observations which were absolutely not a description of what happened in a general population of South Africa, but only the people and the weird community he was interested in. And that's, it's in the end, it might be a bit different from the corporate examples that I've mentioned before, in the sense that there's no attempt to generalize, it's just trying to find some inspiration. But the common thread between the two examples is that both are use field research and a peculiar type of ethnography to design something. Could be about like what is common in a population or what is not, what is very extreme and weird and strange that leads to this kind of artifact. So again, it's field research to feed or to inspire creative decisions. So third example, and that's from my own practice, a project that is quite old now. Project I've done when I was at Art Center in Pasadena in California. Design fiction project in which I was interested in the gestures we do with digital technologies. If you have this kind of device, you're always gesticulating. Like if you have to calibrate your GPS, you do this kind of gesture. When people get nervous, they tend to do things like this, like cigarette package back in the days. So I was interested in that. And what I did with the team I worked with was to start from an exploration, like field research, both in Europe and in California, to observe the gestures we do with digital technologies, taking pictures, interviewing people, videotaping situation on the streets in different contexts, and then turn that into documentation. We did this booklet that tried to categorize the different type of gestures, the different type of body engagement with technology. This one's called the angry monkey. It's when you do this with the iPhone to calibrate the GPS. If you don't know, I mean, if you see someone on the street and you don't know what it is, it might look like a very angry ape or monkey. So that was the documentation, sort of like ethnographic / design documentation with drawings based on the pictures we've taken, text that tries to put things in context. And then we did a series of mock-ups and prototypes that we showed in a short movie that speculates about the futures of those gestures. The idea being that by knowing about the gestures we do with technology nowadays, we can learn about what we might do later on with augmented reality glasses, brain-computer interaction headsets, that kind of technology exists, gestural interaction to, well, open your car. And here in the video, there are several examples. In that examples, you have two persons in a cafe. They stop talking to one another, and they're making gestures like this, recharging the battery of their phone and augmented reality glasses. And that's just a speculation between what exists as a gesture, like the kind of nervous gesture we already do with technology, and speculate about their future. That's another example. The person is watching a movie with the glasses, and each time there's advertisement, she removes the glasses because that's annoying. And that's, I mean, it's no big deal. I mean, it's not like a big design concept, but the idea would be to show a sort of vision of what happened in the future with new pieces of technology, and see how, with this kind of rituals or gestures with technology, we appropriate those things and try to ponder or to show an alternative version of all the videos of like big corporations showing like shiny product that always work and here in this context, like we see that it breaks down and there are problems and people need to gesticulate to solve those problems. So the idea would be to, in this context, to use ethnography and field research as a way to not only inspire creative decisions, but also think about the consequences of technologies in the future. It's not a science. It's not a prediction. I don't necessarily think that this will happen. It's just doing like betting on scenarios, on the possibilities of technology, and using this to have discussions about the consequences of technology and the design directions one could take in design project. And I generally use this project with clients not as a way to show that the future is going to be crappy and bad, but as a way to try to anticipate the problems and the consequences of wrongly designed projects. Fourth case, relationship between observation and design. Here, that's a project you may have heard of by Tim Arnall and his colleagues, which is based on, the starting point in the project was to understand or to observe what's wireless signals, what's network technology, what are network technologies around us, what are they? They're not visible. Can we make them visible as a way to notice their presence in like the world around us? And what they did, because they were interested in observing things, what they did was to design this sort of mast, or like it's like a stick with different LEDs that can be activated depending on the Wi-Fi signals. So if there's no Wi-Fi, the LEDs are not activated. If there's Wi-Fi, they're activated like this. And using and so as you can see, there's Wi-Fi here. The guy hold the stick, and then the LEDs are all activated. And using this, and like slow motion videos or stop motion, they managed to. They just had to stand there with the stick and the LEDs, and then move like few centimeters away, and that helped them to map the sort of Wi-Fi shield that you can find around any building in Western countries in general, and that's quite interesting from my perspective here, because it's very different from what I've described before. They had field research and ethnography and observation to feed or inspire creative decisions. Here it's how designing an object like this very basic stick can help to make us observe this kind of wireless presence in the world here in which we live in. So field observations produced via or through the creative decisions of the designers. Fifth example, and here I go back to anthropology or sociology. In anthropology, in the last probably 15 to 20 years, there's been a lot of interest in infrastructures, observing the infrastructures around us. Could be buildings, could be roads, could be infrastructures of transportation, it could be communication infrastructures. That's a very interesting article by an anthropologist called Susan Lee-Starr. And the reason why I show you this is that this may feel a bit academic and remotely connected to what you're doing, but there's designers and artists as well who technology designers and artists who are interested in trying to reveal those infrastructures, trying to, through their design work, to make these infrastructures visible. So you may have noticed when you're on the streets, here it's in New York, but it's the same in Paris. You will see paintings like that on the street that signal that there's generally gas or electricity networks below, and there's going to be some construction workers doing something here afterwards. So this designer, Ingrid Burrington, she was interested in that, in this kind of observing the infrastructure type of thing, and she did a project called Seeing Networks, in which she tried to map or categorize the different networked or communication technologies you can find in New York City using drawings. So here you have surveillance cameras. Those are phone antennas. This is a bit similar than an antenna, just allowed to repeat the signals of phones. And the others, I don't know what they are, but she was interested in this, and she created this. She designed this very nice book called Networks of New York. I think there's a second edition now, which is far bigger than this, and she called it an Internet Infrastructure Field Guide. And if you bought the book, she could offer you a short trip in New York City and explain you where the infrastructures are located, where the surveillance infrastructure are located if you're really anxious. And that's another type of design contribution that is very close to ethnography in the sense that observations were transformed to make something understandable and visible to people. So here, as in the previous example, it's the designer's work that tries to do ethnography in an original kind of way. Another project that is very similar. It's a project called Bubbles of Radio. It's a designer interested in all those different wireless signals, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, and she was interested in how people represent, or how people build a mental representation of those wireless signals. And she created a book and this poster of different. It's like beings or like weird animals or weird monsters that are shaped based on the interviews she conducted with users of those communication protocols. And she used that later on in a project to, well, also inspire and feed her design decision. So that's, I mean, all those projects, they're quite different, but I think they're interesting in the sense that they reflect the diversity of designers' work and designers' contribution to, well, corporate world, academic projects, creative projects, which are done like without any type of client. But as I mean, if we had to take a step back and think about the contribution of those designers in social sciences or anthropology, for instance, it's quite interesting to try to find the difference between those examples, and how, well, social scientists do ethnography. If we want to understand what's the difference with designers, with the designerly way of doing that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. So, and sorry, I couldn't find the English version of that quote. It's a quote from Claude Lévi-Strauss, a famous French anthropologist interviewed by Didier Ribon a few years ago, and I'm really interested in that quote because it says that anthropologists were already interested in the materiality of ethnography before there was some sort of design ethnography type of thing going on. So here I could translate it very roughly. So basically, Lévi-Strauss, what he says here is that the transformation, the sort of cultural or anthropological transformation, he was noticing. It was in Brazil, in South America. He was unable to represent them by thinking about them, and he had to use cardboard, paper, and a piece of string to build model. And he used Calder as an example. Calder's famous artist doing models, and he said that he had to design something, like manipulate matter and shape something that would help him to like understand the population and the culture he was interested in. And I think that's quite interesting because it means that there's an interesting dialogue that can happen between anthropologists and designers along the way. And this debate, I mean, I don't want to give you too many references about that in social sciences, but this debate is ongoing in social sciences. It's a very important debate whether we should, as anthropologists, use only text or use other means of design, for instance, to, well, turn observation into something that could be understandable by people. If you're interested in that, there's the Sensory Ethnography Lab at Harvard University, which is really into this, interested in films and how making films in an original and peculiar kind of way could help to do ethnography. One of their most famous projects is called Leviathan, and it's about the users of this fishing boat, and it's an entire movie. There's almost no no talking in there. It's mostly GoPros, which are located on the boat, and you can really feel, I mean, you can really feel physically how difficult it is to be a fisherman on that kind of boat. And that's one of the reasons they call themselves sensory ethnography lab, because they want to reflect on different senses using their type of design work, which is mostly film. So I think that's an interesting example and dialogue between the creativity of designers and artists, applied art, and anthropology. But if there's an intersection, and if this intersection between design and social sciences existed before, what is new? And that's the type of thing that I'm interested in lately. So, give you an example that I think reflect the new possibilities of how designers appropriated ethnography and turned that into something creative to document the world around us. I really like that project called Italian Limes, made by an agency called Folder. For the there's been an exhibit in Karlsruhe in Germany about modernity and the Anthropocene by Bruno Latour, the French anthropologist. And one of the projects that caught my attention was this one by designers interested in documenting something as complex as frontiers and the boundaries between countries, which is normally something that is quite fixed, that doesn't change, but the world is complex, and the boundary, the frontier between Italy and Austria is something strange because it changes. Because obviously in the way Italy and Austria dealt with their mutual relationship, they said that the glacier, the ice field between the two countries, would be the limit between the two countries. But obviously with the climate change that we have, depending on the season of the year, the glacier's limit changes. And it means that the frontiers between Italy and Austria changes. So the designers were interested in this as both as a physical problem and a political problem, and they did this project. You don't really see here, but there's this sort of prototypes of mock-up of the mountains between Austria and Italy, and there's a red line that goes here that changes in real time because they put some sensors in the mountain, and the sensors communicate on a regular basis with this installation, and you can see the movement of the frontier. And there's another thing on the upper side, upper part of the picture, where there's a pen that draws the frontier on paper, and you can have every day in the exhibit, you can have the evolution of the boundaries between Austria and Italy. And the reason why I show you this is that one of the main contribution of design with regards to conducting ethnography is the use of digital technologies to, well, help us document things in the world that could be very tricky to understand. Like this example, for instance, the Wi-Fi shield around the buildings, for instance, that I've presented before. I mean, beforehand, it was really difficult to represent that. And with those technological means, it's possible to do it in a way that is quite creative and also interesting from a social science point of view. I'm going to skip that one too. I'm reaching the conclusion here. There's this quote by a social scientist that I like a lot, Laura Forlano, who I think, of course, it takes the perspective of ethnographers and not as designers, but I think this applies to design as well. And one of the difference, I mentioned digital technologies as a big difference. Another difference is the fact that by designing something based on ethnography, by observing things, by conducting interview, and designing something based on this material can also be a way to open up the discussions with people and not treat people just as informants that feed the design process or helps us create a new product or service, but help us to, well, have a general debate about the state of the world that we live in. And that's quite interesting and important in an era of co-creation and this kind of opening type of debates. And that might be the third contribution of design with regards to ethnography, is the fact that designers are, it's a projective work. Design is about creating things that get seen to the world afterwards, that can be used by people. So design is about the future. It could be in the near future, it could be longer term, but it's about the future, which is quite different from how sociologists or anthropologists are conducting their work. And I quite like this quote by I think it's a Danish design researcher, Joachim Hatz, who's working on trying to frame how design could be an ethnography of the possible by documenting the here and now and speculating about the future, creating artifacts that can be used by people, could be used to, well, materialize consequences of technology, materialize possibilities, materialize things that could be, and in the end, could be perceived as a sort of speculative type of documentation about the future, which is quite different from what anthropologists are doing, but there's like a nice combinations between social sciences and design here. So what does it mean? That's the other way to say conclusion. So between social sciences and applied arts, there's this interesting intersection that I'm trying to understand. There are not just one way to have those two circles intersect. What I'm interested in personally in my own work is to start from a social phenomenon. It could be, well, how people gesticulate with technology, how people stop using a car, for instance, how people try to find a place in a city they don't know anything about, and try to document that in a way that could be, well, more than just a monography, more than just text. It could be like doing a photo book, doing like graphic posters, an exhibit, fanzine. We're working on a fanzine with my colleagues to try to exemplify and illustrate how different ways to represent a social phenomenon could be interesting, and then use that later on to speculate about like the future of this social phenomenon by creating so-called design fictions, representation of the consequences of technologies materialized by other type of object. Could be a video, could be a catalog, could be a fictional newspaper, a user manual of product that don't exist. And this is the type of approach that I try to apply in my work, and that try to ties in design and social sciences. This is interesting as well, and that may be a bit abstract here, but this is interesting because if I had to summarize what happened in the last 30 years in this intersection between ethnography and design, there's been two important shifts. The first one is ethnography was appropriated by designers, by other people as well, marketing, for instance, but also that design education in the context of academia, design schools, have shifted from the humanities to, well, social sciences or more positivist type of scientific type of teaching. And that's interesting because it means that there's not just one way to apply ethnography in the context of design school. In many ways, there's a sort of repertoire that is quite wide. And I mean, the examples, the case studies I've presented, they're just like this repertoire. I mean, there's no better way. It just depends on the purposes and the context in which designers are operating. So in the end, there's design ethnography, which is quite general, but there's field research for design. There's designers doing field research to, well, inspire their work. But there's also that's what I'm mostly interested in, and that's that I try to show at the end of the presentation is also ethnography through design, and that's where design research, design work can be a good contribution to social sciences, to show that design can have a way to produce comment something about the world, describe the world in an original way, and that's our contribution in a design context. And of course, there are many other questions, but I don't want to take too much of your time. Thank you very much.
Well, I guess it's time for some questions before going to have some refreshments. I mean, I see new people. Hello, Rémi. We had another PCA talk presenter who came specially, so thank you very much, Rémi, for coming. I had a question, but maybe I can start and you tell me. But what I really like about what you presented today is that I can feel free, or you're freeing me as a designer or as an artist or to actually appropriate this tool as much as I want. And that's the thing that I believe it's very freeing at a time where discourse can be really locking us into a space that is probably a little bit more scientific or but it's just like give us the opportunity to experiment with things. It's like as you're telling us as designers that we somehow allowing for ethnography to renew itself. I mean, this is the feel I have, or that's the understanding of what you're saying. But maybe you can tell us the relation with art, or a little bit more about that, and how this is actually changing, maybe, or perturbing the way we traditional designers may think of ethnography. Maybe that's a too complex question.
There are two points. The first one, I agree that it could be liberating.
Yeah.
But at the same time, depending on the context you operate in, like I guess here it's different. In the design school it's different. But if you're in, let's say, in an academic context, like I take my academic hat from design school in Switzerland, and I want to apply for research funding about ethnography and design, the chances are that if I show this, it's going to be refused. It's like, no, this is absolutely not scientific. So it's quite nice, your applied art type of things, but and I won't comment on the reasons. There are many reasons about that. The one could be like the positivist kind of type of research that is often have a positive bias for, but there are many other reasons. So depending on the context, and of course the case studies I've presented show that, especially in a corporate context, I'm not sure you would do the other examples that I've presented afterwards. So context could be one problem, but at the same time, I think it can be useful from a design education point of view, in the context of training programs, even with companies. I work with private clients who are really interested in that, regardless of the weird aspects that I've presented. Now the perturbations. In design circles in which the designer is an author and have some sort of very romantic type of perspective on what should be design, and that's quite common these days still in continental Europe. That might feel strange, like you want to interview and observe people. Why would you want to do that? You're a designer, you should know what to do. So it means that perspective in which you try to build an understanding of people. If you call them user or consumers, that's your problem. But that could be very problematic in some design circles, in which trying to make this kind of process or an approach quite objective could be like a no-go or something that some designers don't want to talk about. I've seen that in some design schools or in some design circles, but then I mean things are changing, and I don't necessarily mean that what I've presented here is the scientific method, is the rigorous method to go from A to B and be sure about the results. Just ways to try to minimize the ambiguity or the uncertainty of design projects. So that's, I mean, there are pros and cons. I don't know if that answers your question. But.
Yeah. My name is Kalina.
Hi.
I would like to ask, can you give an example of a collaboration you had with the company, like if you worked on a product, how would you influence the product? I have no idea exactly what kind of collaboration you had.
Well, it depends on the type of client. Like we generally work on two types of project. The first type of project would be like standard user-centered design type of things, where there's like field research for a while, like generally over the course of a few months, and the idea would be then to help the client design a product or a service. Can't tell necessarily all the name of the clients, but let's say in the context of the car business, worked with a client on what happens when people use like those car sharing systems and stop buying a car. So the idea would be to, in this context, the idea was to understand what's the user experience of not having a car and using those services, and do a series of workshops with the client to refine their designs, their service for a project that is very similar to a car sharing system. So that's like the short-term project. Longer-term project would be to do something similar, field research, interviews, observation, participant observation, and use that to speculate about the future of their technology. We recently worked with a Spanish bank in Madrid on what digital services based on your personal data and your financial data. What would that mean in the near future? So we did some observation and interviews with users of digital banking services, and then we worked a series of design fiction projects, like scenarios for like 3 to 5 years in the future that could happen, and use that as a way to start a debate in the bank with some of the different projects and stakeholders.
The new kind of process? Isn't it like
that was my intention was to give a talk about design ethnography without saying the word design thinking, but it's quite similar. It's just that design thinking, there's so many definitions. If you ask people, especially in France, what design thinking is, there would be a lot of different definitions, and it's often misunderstood. So I try not to use that term, but it's close to
the ideal.
Yes, it's close to like in the main book about it.
It's like Voldemort.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. I have two questions. One, in your presentation, you're often mixing art and design, like
Applied arts.
Applied art. Yeah, I was wondering if you had any collaboration with fine art or like visual art. What was because it's two worlds.
Yeah, it's two words, but in different contexts. Like the design school I'm part of, it's applied art and arts, and we have discussions. We don't have necessarily projects and collaborations apart from like quick cafe at a cafeteria. But I'm well aware that this kind of debate, like the relationship between ethnography and applied arts, also happened in fine arts.
Yes.
The text by Hal Foster, the artist as an ethnographer. That's also a very important topic there. I try to be a bit like I go step by step. Like I try to limit the perimeter around like this kind of example. But I'm also interested in that, and in photography and cinema. I mean, there's been a lot of discussions about that for ages, and also in fine art, and a description of the world around us is also the role of artists in a way. But I at this point, I can't say much about that because I've limited the perimeter to applied arts. But it's definitely interesting. It's just like a Pandora's box. So I just opened the can of worms. Yep.
Actually, let's have Rémi. You wanted to have a question. There is another question here. And then I suggest that we go to the refreshment side to continue the conversation. And I actually have also it's a traditional final question to ask you, but I'll wait for Rémi and I'll wait.
I'm anxious now.
Rémi, please.
I have two.
No, just one.
So I'd like your perspective on how the practice of ethnography is progressing in the context where even friends of us, like some Pinterest, are falling into the Steve Jobs syndrome where you eat your own dog food, you design for yourself, basically. You don't do field study. And because of the cost of prototyping, getting to the market quick, having quantitative data, then there is a tension that there's always been to avoid getting on the field, or thinking ahead and just go make your thing, see how it works. And also that perspective, that recurrent tension between qualitative and quantitative study in moving ahead. So I'd like your on the other hand, Facebook now is going back on the field because they know, although we see them as one of the top guys who apply big data very well, they acknowledge that actually sometimes they have no clue why people are clicking certain things on the wall rather than some others. And so they go back to field study. They are supposed to be the rock stars of big data to a large extent. They have now groups of people that they follow regularly, and they admitted that publicly. So I'd like your opinion on how is the practice is progressing. It's probably an interesting thing for students to understand that. People might, on one hand, some people say nobody needs the ethnography anymore somehow to carry it a little bit. And even if you design for yourself, it's even better, which I hear a lot from the Silicon Valley. So why go and observe people if you do know what you design for yourself? Many companies do that. At all, Decathlon, they're successful in this respect. And so that's my question.
Well, with the advent of big data and data analytics, especially if you're a software company, it's easy to collect a lot of information about people, and you can, well, try to build models of those people based on those data. And there's been a lot of interest. I'm just trying to contextualize what Femi just said. There's been a lot of interest in this because you can automate that, and once you automate that, you realize that, oh, maybe you don't necessarily need to go on the field and interview people and observe them. And there's this tension between the quantitative data, numbers, statistics, statistical models, and observing people using like videos, photos, interviews, quotes, and all this material. And the thing is that both are not necessarily exclusive. Of course, for a company which has a limited amount of money, they could be seen as exclusive. But in my perspective, they could be combined. There's a lot of interest in what's called ethno-mining, ethnography, and data mining, running statistics on data that try to combine the two. And generally, this debate happened already in the social sciences about statistics. Like 40 years ago, it's now back in social sciences with big data and analytics. And the thing is that it's different what you get, when the insights you get, depending on those approaches, are quite different. Of course, at the end of the day, if you're a company, if you're designers, you need to make choices, and you can't always do both. But I think there's value in having this kind of spectrum of approaches. And I agree with what you said. Even like last year, in the last few years, there's been a lot of disinterest, like, oh no, we're going to stop doing field research and let's move to analytics. And now some companies get back to combining the two, because it's the two of them, because there's value in that. I think personally, and I've been trained in both, I think there's value in the two of them.
Maybe the last question.
So you come from a journey from cognitive sciences, and I was wondering what your original interest in cognitive sciences was, and if you find yourself still mining after those same interests, even though you're now kind of more geared to design.
Well, I at first, originally, before cognitive science, I have a degree in life sciences. So I was interested in like human beings in nature and how we interact with the world. Perhaps I should have gone to anthropology, but I'm going back to that now. What I think is interesting in the context of being in a design school and in design research agency is the fact that I need to think differently about the same problems, especially by thinking about the materiality and by shaping things and that's like this type of designerly way of doing things, designerly way of thinking about like doing research, thinking about the world around us. That's what I find quite interesting, and I find that also much more liberating as a researcher. That's back to the discussion we were having. Quite liberating in the sense that design is there's a tradition of applied art to be quite holistic, to take different phenomena into account and try to combine them, and by using materiality to render or to document things, it's way different than what would happen in like anthropology, as I tried to show, or in other fields. But in the end, the intersection between all those different components. I mean, for a curious person, I'm curious about doing research. That just I think that's a benefit. That's good to think about the same issues with a different kind of perspective and angle. More questions?
No, I think we'll go to have some refreshments, but the tradition is to ask the last question. And basically, we'll always ask our speaker to tell us about a life-changing experience in the course of your career and your learning experience. And what was that moment that made you realize something?
So many.
A learning experience.
Well, spending time, anytime I'm on the field, spending time with people, I'm always surprised. There's always even half an hour ago, or probably an hour ago on the street, observing people. And I mean, it's not necessarily life-changing as you would expect, but that's a way to build my understanding about the world. And anytime I can just spend some time watching the world around me, that helps.
Basically, you're saying you're always surprised.
Yeah, and always on, ears on the ground.
That's great. Thank you very much. I thank you so much for attending.